My name is Clay Anderson, I'm 40 years old, and I never imagined that my life would take such a strange turn. The story I'm about to tell might surprise many people, perhaps even you. From the outside, everyone thought I had a dream life, a penthouse in the heart of Manhattan, lavish social events, and a husband who was a respected top surgeon. Everyone said I was lucky. But behind the glamorous facade was a truth I couldn't share with anyone. Loneliness. Ethan, my husband, had become a guest in our own home. His long surgeries and business trips to international conferences eventually made the nights he came home rare. Our conversations grew shorter, revolving only around work schedules and monthly bills. One quiet April afternoon, as the pale sunlight filtered into the corners of the room, I received a text from Ethan. "Emergency surgery. I'll be home late. Don't wait for me for dinner." I wasn't surprised. This happened almost every day. I set my phone down on the table and asked myself, when will I stop hoping? The doorbell rang, breaking my thoughts. I walked over and opened the door. Standing in front of me was Mason Turner, Ethan's younger brother. He had just returned from Los Angeles after finishing a documentary film. Mason had slightly messy dark hair, thoughtful eyes, and broad shoulders draped in a worn leather jacket. "Clay." Mason beamed at me. "New York is as loud as ever, huh?" I forced a tired smile, but Mason's arrival felt like a gust of fresh air in this cold, empty apartment. "Welcome home, Mason," I said as he stepped in. I could feel a shift in the atmosphere. The suffocating silence that usually filled the apartment seemed to fade away. Mason always carried this strange energy, gentle yet contemplative. A few minutes later, just as I was pouring us coffee, a voice called out from the door. "Did anyone miss me?" I turned around and saw Dylan Hayes, Ethan's best friend. Dylan looked different from the last time I saw him. His hair was disheveled, his eyes playful behind dark sunglasses, and he wore a rugged weathered jacket. "Dylan," I laughed and rushed to hug him. "I thought you were still in Paris." Dylan shrugged and said, "Paris was too boring. New York is home." He plopped onto the chair with a broad grin. "And it looks like I came just in time. Where's my coffee?" Dylan was always like that, easygoing and full of life, as though he had never left. In that cozy room, I suddenly felt a warmth I hadn't felt in years. We talked for hours about Dylan's adventures in France and Mason's new film project. For the first time in years, I felt alive again. I didn't know what was ahead, but at that moment, I understood that Mason and Dylan's presence would change my life forever. That evening, as the warm golden light filled the room, Mason sat back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful as he stared out of the large window reflecting the twinkling city lights. Dylan sat across from him with a relaxed smile, tapping his fingers to the soft music playing from the corner speaker. "Clea, have you ever thought about going back to writing?" Mason asked, breaking the quiet in the gentlest way. Mason's question was like a soft blade sliding through my memories. Before marrying Ethan, I had been a well-known journalist, writing sharp, insightful articles about New York's culture and people. But life with Ethan had made me give it all up to become the perfect wife. I chuckled lightly, but there was bitterness in my laughter. "Do you really think I can write anything worthwhile after spending my days pacing around this apartment?" Mason didn't answer right away. He looked at me with eyes full of patience and understanding. "You have an entire world inside you, Clay. That's what matters." Dylan raised an eyebrow, breaking the serious mood. "I agree with Mason, but I don't think you just need to write. You need to live. When was the last time you danced?" I laughed harder and shook my head. Dylan always had a way of making things seem lighthearted, but deep inside his words struck a chord in me, echoing like a bell in the stillness of my heart. When the clock struck 9 p.m., Dylan suddenly stood up. "Come on, put on a song. We can't just sit here all night." Before I could protest, he walked over to the control panel and played an upbeat jazz song. Dylan turned around, holding out his hand to me with a mischievous smile. "A great song isn't meant to be listened to while sitting down, CLA." We need to dance. I shook my head and laughed, but couldn't resist Dylan's enthusiasm. I placed my hand in his, and we began taking our first steps across the floor. Dylan spun me around like a professional dancer, and I burst out laughing as I felt his strong yet gentle hands guiding me. Mason sat quietly, watching us for a moment, then suddenly stood up. He walked toward me and gently placed his hand on my waist. "You're not planning to leave me out of the fun, are you?" He smiled softly, but his eyes were deep and intense. Dylan laughed loudly. "Mason, since when did you become such a charmer?" Between the laughter and the music, I felt surrounded by two men who were so different yet strangely complementary. Dylan, humorous and explosive, pulled me out of my dark reality. Mason, calmed and thoughtful, made me feel seen, as though he understood every hidden pain I had buried. In their arms, I could feel my heart beating faster with each beat of the music. The exchanged glances made me feel as though I was dissolving into that moment, a place where there was nothing but music, laughter, and an emotion I had never thought I would experience. When the song slowed into a gentler rhythm, Mason leaned close and whispered into my ear, "CLA, I've never seen you smile this much." Dylan pulled me closer from behind and said softly, "And you look so alive. Do you know how beautiful you are when you let yourself go?" I felt overwhelmed, but couldn't look away from them. Their words were like a mirror reflecting the part of myself that I had forgotten during the long years of marriage. Between the two of them, I felt both lost and found at the same time. I wanted to stop, but my heart whispered something else. Why not live for yourself? Just this once. That night, I knew my life had turned a new chapter, and there was no going back. The soft jazz still played throughout the room, but I could no longer hear the melody clearly. The sound of laughter and dancing footsteps had faded. Only slow, steady breaths filled the dimly lit room, glowing from the city lights outside. Mason stood right in front of me, his deep eyes gazing into mine as though he could see straight into my soul. His hands gently held my arms, the warmth from his skin spreading like a slow-burning fire that made me tremble. "Do you know, I've always hoped for the day you'd truly live for yourself," Mason whispered, his voice low and gentle, but making my heart pound like a drum. Before I could answer, Dylan stepped closer from behind, placing his hand on my shoulder, a touch both subtle and firm. "CLA," Dylan whispered near my ear, his warm breath brushing against my neck, making my senses blur. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. Just live by what you feel." I closed my eyes, trying to suppress the waves of emotion crashing over me, but when I opened them again, all I saw were Mason's tender eyes and Dylan's half-teasing, half-understanding smile. Mason slowly leaned in, his face so close I could feel his breath on my cheek. I wanted to step back, to hold on to reason, but my heart whispered that it was too late. Mason's kiss came like a soft breeze, but burned through every inch of my body. His lips were soft, gentle, but carried a fierce longing he had held back for too long. Time seemed to stop. From behind, Dylan stepped in closer, wrapping his arms around me like a protective shield, a silent affirmation. I felt his strong chest press against my back, and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat matching the chaotic drumming of mine. "Play, Dilla." Dylan's warm voice resonated in my ear like a comforting lullaby. He bent down and left a soft kiss on my hair. I didn't know what was right or wrong anymore. I only knew that in this moment I was myself, a woman brimming with the need to live and be loved. Mason's hand moved from my arm down to my waist, his fingers both gentle and firm, as though affirming that I belonged to this moment. Dylan remained behind me, his breath steady but filled with desire as it brushed the nape of my neck, waking every nerve in my body. "Mason!" I gasped as I felt the warmth from both sides. Dylan leaned in and whispered near my ear again, "We only live once, Clay." With every emotion flooding through me, I turned to face them both. The final wall of my reason crumbled completely. I had crossed the line I had built to protect myself. Mason's fingers slid into my hair, pulling me closer into a deep kiss. Dylan gently traced his hand along my shoulder, his eyes shining as though he was memorizing every second of this moment. In that instant, I didn't just feel physical closeness, it was something deeper. A rare connection of souls, a harmony that the three of us felt together. Everything else faded away, leaving only the sound of rapid breathing and the pounding of my heart in the quiet room. Their warmth surrounded me, making me forget every rule, every fear I had once clung to. I closed my eyes, letting myself sink into the raw emotions I had buried for so long. Each breath, each heartbeat felt like an echo reverberating through my chest. Tonight there were no limits left. When the room returned to stillness, I rested my head on Mason's shoulder, my eyes half open, gazing at the glittering New York skyline. Dylan leaned in and placed a soft kiss on my forehead, and we all knew there was no going back to the way things had been. The room fell silent, except for the slow notes of jazz drifting like a breeze. The city lights outside the glass windows cast soft golden glimmers, twinkling like lost stars. But I didn't see anything except the two men beside me. I asked myself, what am I doing? Is this even real? Mason's hand still rested lightly on my waist, the warmth of his touch tethering me to reality while simultaneously pulling me into a hazy dream. My heartbeat thudded loudly in my ears, chaotic like a war drum. I felt his gaze trailing over my face, both gentle and scorching, burning away every last shred of my reasoning. From behind, Dylan's arm stayed wrapped gently around me, his breath brushing softly against my hair. That familiar closeness overwhelmed me, as if I had belonged to this moment all along without ever realizing it. CLA, Mason whispered, his voice soft like a distant echo, yet pulling me back into this reality full of passion and longing. Dylan leaned down, his lips close to my ear. "What are you thinking?" he asked, though his voice carried a certainty as if he already knew my answer. Before I could speak, I wanted to respond that I didn't know. I wasn't sure what was right or wrong. My mind was a blur, but my heart had already surrendered completely. Mason gently brushed his hand along my cheek, his eyes glowing with a quiet intensity. His touch was tender, but I could feel the fragile restraint beneath it. He leaned closer, our lips nearly touching again. This time, there was no hesitation. His kiss was both strong and soft, like he was pouring all his unsaid emotions into a silent symphony. I couldn't resist it. I let myself be fully consumed by Mason's warmth. Time felt like it had stopped. There was nothing left but the wild rhythm of my heart and the way his arms held me tightly. But I didn't forget that Dylan was still there. He stepped closer, his eyes retaining their playful glint, but now laced with an unfamiliar seriousness and strength. "Don't forget about me, CLA," Dylan said quietly, his voice low but I turned to look at him, and Dylan pulled me into a tight embrace from the front. His gentle smile dissolved every lingering fear within me. I felt the warmth of his chest against mine, his hand softly tilting my chin upward, and then his kiss came like a storm, sweeping away all the boundaries I had once known. Between the two of them, I felt like a sleepwalker, crossing forbidden lines without even realizing it. I was no longer the woman who woke up to lonely, quiet mornings. I was someone new, a woman who craved to live fully with every emotion she had. Mason softly took my hand, pulling me into his arms once more. His gaze locked onto mine as though he wanted to etch this moment into his memory forever. Dylan stood close, his hand gliding gently along my shoulder like a conductor orchestrating a symphony meant only for the three of us. Our ragged breaths intertwined in the quiet room, and their touches weren't just physical. They felt like unspoken confessions. The emotion in the room was so overwhelming that I felt like I might melt. I closed my eyes, surrendering to every sensation. I didn't know how much time had passed. All I knew was that I was utterly captivated in their embrace. Yet, amidst it all, a small voice echoed in my mind. "Clay, is this really what you want? What are you doing?" I opened my eyes and saw Mason and Dylan looking at me with eyes filled with love, but also a trace of worry, as though they feared I might step away or break the moment. But as I met their gaze, I knew I had no regrets. I whispered, my voice soft but resolute, "I've never felt this real before." The room was silent except for our breathing and the pounding of our hearts. I knew that this moment was the point of no return. I had crossed the final boundary, and I didn't want to go back. I leaned into the couch, feeling as though the entire world had shrunk to the warmth of Mason and Dylan on either side of me. Mason gently pulled me against his chest, his arms wrapping around me like a silent reassurance. On the other side, Dylan sat close, his eyes reflecting an emotion difficult to name, tender, a little reckless, but sincere. I tilted my head back and closed my eyes, letting that rare sense of peace flow through every cell in my body. For the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. I belonged to this moment, to their warmth. But when I opened my eyes and looked at Mason and Dylan, a wave of conflicting emotions surged through me. Is this true happiness? Or is this just a fleeting escape from the loneliness of reality? Mason softly brushed my hair, his gaze full of affection. "Clay, you don't have to think too much. Just know that we're here, right beside you." His gentle words were like a lullaby, lulling me into a dream. But they also made my heart tremble with fear. Dylan's familiar low voice broke the silence. "Sometimes we need to live for ourselves, Clay. Is it wrong to seek a moment that makes you feel alive?" I turned to look at him, and Dylan's eyes seemed to see straight through my thoughts. But as I faced him and Mason, the invisible fear within me became clearer. I wasn't afraid of them. I was afraid of myself. Afraid that these feelings were just a beautiful dream that would vanish with the morning light. I chuckled softly, but there was something lost in that laugh. Dylan furrowed his brows as if he'd noticed it too. "What are you thinking, Clay?" I hesitated for a moment before whispering, "I'm not sure. I'm just afraid I'll wake up and everything will disappear like a dream." Mason gently took my hand, his warm fingers enclosing mine as they trembled slightly. "It's not a dream, Clay," he said softly. "What you feel is real." Dylan sat down beside me, his gaze more serious than ever. "CLA, we can't replace everything in your life, but the one thing we can do is make sure you know that you don't have to face it all alone." Those words felt like they pierced right through my soul. Suddenly, a tear slid down my cheek. I couldn't remember the last time I had cried. Maybe it was on one of those lonely nights in this cold apartment when Ethan had been away for weeks. The feeling of being loved, being touched, and being understood hit me like a tidal wave, only to be followed by a stillness full of contradictions. I didn't know where this would lead, but for the first time in my life, I didn't want to care about the consequences. Mason gently wiped the tear from my cheek and said softly, "Don't think about tomorrow, CLA. Right now, we're here together." Dylan smiled faintly and added, "And that's all that matters." I nodded slightly, letting myself sink into the moment once more. But deep down, I could still hear a voice whispering in my mind, "What will happen when the night ends? Will the morning light make everything disappear?" I didn't have an answer, but I knew that no matter how this ended, I would always remember this moment. The place where I felt alive and fully loved, no longer the shadow of a forgotten wife in someone else's world. But it was in this very moment that I realized I had stepped into a new chapter of my life, and there was no way back to what it had been. The morning light seeped through the thin curtains, stretching across the warm wooden floor. New York City was waking up to the sound of car horns and footsteps on the busy streets below. But in this quiet room, time seemed to move more slowly. I opened my eyes, the soft glow of the sun making me squint against the sharpness of reality. Mason was still lying beside me, his breathing steady like a gentle song lulling me back to sleep. Dylan leaned against the sofa, his eyes half closed, but I could sense that he hadn't fallen into a deep sleep. My heart tightened as the reality of where I was settled over me in the aftermath of the long night. What have I done? The thought echoed in my mind like a shout in an empty room. I moved slightly, trying not to make a sound, but as I reached for the jacket draped over the chair, Mason opened his eyes. His gaze was still filled with tenderness, but there was something different. No longer the dreamy haze of the night before, but a flicker of unease. "Good morning," Mason whispered, his voice husky. I gave a small nod and smiled faintly, but inside I felt a whirlwind of emotion. Dylan shifted and sat upright, his gaze unusually contemplative as he looked at me. "Are you okay?" Dylan asked, as though he was trying to decipher what I was thinking from my uncertain expression. I wanted to answer, to say that I was fine, but how could I when I didn't even know how I felt? The atmosphere grew heavier as we looked at each other. There were no more innocent smiles, no more playful teasing like the night before. Only glances filled with awkwardness, as if we were all struggling to find the right words to break the silence. Mason stepped closer and gently placed a hand on my shoulder. "Clay, you don't need to say anything. We all know this is complicated." Dylan stood up, shook out his jacket, and sighed. "Yeah, but the only thing I don't want to see is regret in your eyes." I looked at Dylan. His usual mischievous glint was gone, replaced by a rare seriousness. His words felt like a knife slicing through my heart. "Regret?" I asked myself. "Do I regret this, or am I just afraid of these feelings I've never dared to acknowledge?" No one said anything else. I stood up and slipped on my jacket, feeling as though I needed to shield myself from their gaze. Mason stepped forward as if he wanted to say something but hesitated, as though he was afraid any words would shatter the fragile moment between us. Dylan quietly shoved his hands into his jacket pockets and turned away, as if trying to hide something. The spacious room suddenly felt suffocatingly small. Every glance, every movement seemed to stir up the tangled emotions inside me. I turned away and walked toward the large window, looking down at the bustling crowd below. Life outside carried on as if nothing had happened, but inside me everything had changed completely. Mason and Dylan stood on opposite sides of the room, like two opposing forces within my soul. I felt as though I was standing in the middle, not just physically, but emotionally. "It's Claw." Mason spoke again, his voice soft but urgent. "You don't have to decide anything right now." Dylan stepped closer but kept a small distance, as though he didn't want me to feel pressured. "Take your time. But no matter what, remember, we don't want to see you hurting or filled with guilt anymore." Dylan's words nearly brought me to tears. Everything I had hidden away, loneliness, the yearning to be loved and understood, was now laid bare in front of these two men in a way that was almost unbearably raw. I turned back to face them. The awkwardness in our eyes wasn't just because of what had happened. It was because of everything left unsaid. Delicate feelings that felt like they could shatter with just one breath. I wanted to say something, but all I could whisper was, "I need time." Mason nodded, his gaze as gentle as ever. Dylan exhaled a quiet breath, but he didn't argue or urge me further. The room fell into silence again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It felt like a necessary pause before we all faced the truth of the tomorrow. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I knew this wasn't just the end of a long night. It was the beginning of an entirely new chapter in my life. I stood in front of the large window, the skyscrapers in the distance looming like invisible walls encircling the city. The sound of cars and blaring horns echoed outside, but everything felt muffled behind the thick glass. Inside this room, it was just me, Mason, and Dylan, and emotions too complex for words. I clenched my hands together, trying to steady myself. Memories from the night before replayed in my mind like a slow-motion film. The glances, the laughter, the touches that made my heart race. Claw, you need to do something. Everything has changed. Forever. Mason stepped closer, his eyes still gentle, but filled with worry. He placed his hand on my shoulder, his voice soft but weighted. Clay, we can't live in limbo forever. You know that, don't you? I looked deeply into his eyes filled with sincerity and love. Dylan stood behind me, his expression no longer playful. Instead, there was a quietness, a fear he tried to hide behind a faint smile. I know, I replied, my voice quiet but steady. Dylan stepped forward, holding my hand in his warm grasp. We don't want you to do anything that will hurt you, Clea. I felt the sincerity in his words, and it was that very sincerity that made my heart ache even more. I pulled away from their hands and took a few steps toward the center of the room, as if trying to carve out some space for myself. Each step felt heavy with the weight of the emotions I carried. I had lived in loneliness for so many years, and now that I had found the connection I had longed for, I stood at a difficult crossroads. Mason and Dylan, both of them had made me feel alive in a way I thought I'd lost. But at the same time, I knew that if we continued like this, everything would eventually fall apart. Not just for me, but for them too. We can't hide this forever, I whispered, almost to myself. Mason nodded softly. I know. And no matter what you decide, I will always respect you. Dylan stepped closer, his eyes glimmering with a hint of sadness, but still steady with sincerity. You have the right to live by your feelings, CLA. But the only thing I ask is that you don't live in regret anymore. His words felt like a knife cutting through my soul, but at the same time they were also a release. I lifted my head, and for the first time in a long while, I felt certain about what I needed to do. I took a deep breath and turned to face them, my voice soft but clear with each word. I can't live in the shadows anymore. This is no longer a secret, and if we continue like this, we will lose each other. Mason and Dylan looked at me, their eyes filled with understanding and pain. I stepped toward Mason and gently placed my hand on his cheek. I will always cherish what we have. But now, I need to walk my own path. Dylan's eyes locked onto mine, his lips parting slightly as if he wanted to say something, but he stayed silent. I leaned forward and placed a soft kiss on his cheek. Thank you for reminding me that I am worthy of love. The room seemed to hold its breath as I took a step back, taking one last look at them before turning toward the door. Mason gave me a small nod, and Dylan stood still, his eyes following me, unable to hide the sadness within them. I opened the door and stepped outside, the morning light casting its glow across my face. The crisp morning air brushed through my hair, but inside I felt a strange warmth, the warmth of freedom, of courage, and finally facing myself. I walked down the street, the busy crowd rushing past me. I was still Claw Anderson, but I was no longer the lost woman of yesterday. I had crossed the line, had loved, had made mistakes, and had lived true to my emotions. I didn't know where the future would take me, but I knew that this journey was only just beginning, and no matter what happened, I would never forget these men, the ones who helped me rediscover my true self in this vast world. In my mind, I could still hear Mason's voice. As long as you live true to yourself, that's already a victory. I smiled softly and walked down the sunlit street, my heart filled with hope for the days to come.